It'll be our pleasure now to hear from Jonathan Riley, who is an independent scholar currently pursuing a PhD in Biblical Studies at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. He received an MA in Biblical Studies from Trinity Western University in Langley, Canada, and a BA in Ancient Near Eastern Studies from Brigham Young University. Jonathan spent 3 years working for Book of Mormon Central, writing their informative No Whys. His research interests include the Old Testament and in the Book of Mormon, early Zoroastrianism, Isaiah, the Septuagint, and narrative criticism of the Bible. He served a mission in Tempe, Arizona. We have known Jonathan since his early days as a student and also admire his wife Sarah and their 2 adorable children. They like to hike together, and Jonathan enjoys listening to audiobooks of Second Temple period Jewish texts while fishing. Jonathan will be speaking on Archaism or translation technique, Hebraisms in the Book of Moses. Jonathan.
The Book of Moses, the early chapters of Joseph Smith's revision of the Old Testament, presents some unique challenges, and it may sometimes be difficult to see the overall structure of the text. This is likely because the Book of Moses sometimes demonstrates elements of Hebraic style or Hebraisms. Understanding these Hebraisms can help to make sense of difficult parts of the text. This paper will, number 1, give examples of some traditional Hebraisms in the Book of Moses. Number 2, give examples of Hebrew phrases translated differently in the Book of Moses than in the King James Old Testament. And number 3, give examples of chiasms in the Book of Moses. And number 4, discuss how the evolution of the Hebrew language impacts the search for Hebraisms in the Book of Moses. A Hebraism is an example of an occasion where a text translated from Hebrew into another language reflects the style of the original Hebrew. There are a number of these in the Book of Moses. The first Hebraism I will discuss relates to the relative clause, something we would usually translate as who or which. In English, these words usually come directly after the words they refer to. In Hebrew, this is not the case, and one sometimes sees space between the two. This construction appears in both the Book of Mormon and the Book of Moses. But ye know that the Egyptians were drowned in the Red Sea, who were the armies of Pharaoh, 1 Nephi 17:27, as well as in the Book of Moses, and by the Son I created them, which is mine only begotten. Instead, in English, one would usually expect something like, by the Son, who is my only begotten, I created them. But allowing for some space between these is common in Hebrew. Another Hebraism in the Book of Moses is the compound preposition. Prepositions are words like under, over, around, in, on, etc. Third grade teacher described them as anything a rabbit can do to a log. Compound prepositions do what they sound like they would do. Combine prepositions to act like one word, in front of, on top of, over, against, things like that. One of these appears in Judges 11:23. The Lord God of Israel hath dispossessed the Amorites from before his people Israel. Moses 1:1 similarly uses this construction. Moses was caught up into an exceedingly high mountain. The next Hebraism one finds in the Book of Moses has to do with possessive pronouns like my. English speakers use these words once and have the word apply to an entire list, while Biblical Hebrew repeats these pronouns for each word in the list. Joshua 2:13, for example, states, "You will save alive my father and my mother and my brethren and my sisters." Moses 1:38-39 uses a similar construction. "And there is no end to my works, neither to my words, for behold, this is my work and my glory." One significant example of a Hebraism in the Book of Moses is called presumptive repetition. This is the equivalent of an ancient Hebrew parentheses because ancient Hebrew didn't have punctuation. So in English, when authors want to give an aside, they use a dash or a parentheses. But in ancient Hebrew, authors usually repeated a key phrase shortly before the aside to signal they were returning to the main point. One sees this in the Old Testament in Exodus, for example, but Moses 1 also has Hebraisms like this. Moses 1:4-7 is another good example of this. One Hebraism in the Book of Moses that is of some note is the if-and construction. In English, one generally says that if someone does something, then something will happen. In Hebrew, one finds an if-and construction, in which if someone does something and something will happen. Ken Jackson noticed this construction in the Book of Moses. If thou wilt turn unto me and hearken unto my voice, and believe and repent of all their transgressions, and be baptized even by water, in the name of mine only begotten, which is full of grace and truth, which is Jesus Christ, and ye shall ask all things in his name, and whatsoever ye shall ask, it shall be given. Another Hebraism in the book of Moses that is hard to miss is, and it came to pass. It appears approximately 42 times in just chapters 1 and 5 through 7 of the book of Moses. So often it would almost seem absurd, except that this phrase, a single word in Hebrew, occurs equally often in the Hebrew Bible, appearing 22 times in Genesis 1 alone. This element of the text that appears so often it's almost grating is likely just an example of a tight translation from a Semitic forelogger. An equally grating example is what seems in English like the overuse of the word and. They appear so often in chapter 1 of the book of Moses, the word and, that out of 42 verses in the chapter, only 9 do not begin with and. Although one might simply be tempted to think that this is just Joseph dictating the entire text of the book of Moses as one long run-on sentence, this is actually a common way of writing in Hebrew. This is in part because an ancient Hebrew text doesn't have any punctuation, and long strings of ands make the text comprehensible without using any periods or commas. In addition, this Hebrew word can also be translated as but, meaning this word may even be more common than it already seems. Another Hebraism one finds in the book of Moses is also found in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint. The phrase v'gam and also. This is not necessarily an unusual phrase in English, but the way it's used in Hebrew is slightly different from how one might generally use it in English. See, for example, Moses 8:20 through 21. And it came to pass that Noah called upon the children of men that they should repent, but they hearkened not unto his words, and also, after that they had heard him, and then it continues. Although the way the phrase is used here is not completely absurd, it's not quite what one would expect in English, as I said before. One might expect something like, and after they heard him, or also after they heard him, but not and also. You don't need both words. However, this and also construction is common in Hebrew. In fact, it's so common that a version of the Septuagint that translated v'gam and also hyperliterally as and also instead of just and or also, which is how it's literally used in Hebrew, is known as the kai gay recension, named after the Greeks' odd rendering kai gay and also. And also in Hebrew may more strongly connect two things than just and, meaning that there might be stronger connections between the two things being discussed. And it's things like this that could help us deepen our understanding of the places where this construction appears in the book of Moses. An example of Semitic language that some readers may already have noticed in the previous paragraph is the use of the phrase after that in Moses 8:12. And also, after that they had heard him. This is not how one would usually use the phrase in English. Something like, we went to dinner, and after that we went to the movies, is how we would usually use it. And this way of using it is likely a direct translation from the Hebrew, which sometimes uses the word that after prepositions as a way to begin what's called a subordinate clause. One often sees it with the word because in Hebrew. Genesis 26, for example, states, because that Abraham obeyed my voice, ... This is not meant to signal out Abraham somehow as that Abraham or something, but it's simply a direct translation of the Hebrew word, shar, that, which sometimes comes after the word like, words like because. One sees this in Moses 4:3, wherefore because that Satan rebelled against me. This is not to emphasize Satan, that Satan, but is simply a way of saying, because Satan rebelled against me, when translated directly out of the Semitic language. The next Hebraism in the book of Moses to be examined relates to how the ubiquitous word and is used. Moses 5:4 states that Adam and Eve heard the Lord speaking unto them, and they saw him not, for they were shut out from his presence. One would think that this verse would use the word but instead of and. But it says because it says that God was speaking to them. But Adam and Eve did not see him. However, Hebrew often uses the word and to mean both but and. And in this verse, it seems that Joseph translated the word literally as and, even though one would probably translate it as but, if one were sensitive to the context. This appears to be yet another instance of a literal translation out of a Semitic language in the Book of Moses. Another Hebraism stems in part from the lack of parentheses in Hebrew, like presumptive repetition mentioned earlier, and manifests itself in yet another unusual use of and. Moses 6:6 states that Adam and Eve's children were taught to read and write. Then verses 7 through 8 record two parenthetical statements before getting back to the issue at hand, that these people kept a genealogy. The two parenthetical statements record, "Now this same priesthood which was in the beginning shall be in the end of the world also. Now this prophecy Adam spake as he was moved upon by the Holy Ghost, and a genealogy was kept of the children of God." The two comments following the word now are parenthetical statements that are brought to an end by the word and, which goes back to the topic at hand. This is similar to what one finds in Genesis 18. In these verses 10 through 12, Sarah overhears that she's going to have a son. The text then states, translated hyper-literally, "Now Abraham and Sarah were old and advanced in days, and it was no longer with Sarah after the way of women, and Sarah laughed." The context strongly suggests that Sarah laughs in response to what seems to be the hilarious statement she just overheard that she will have a child in her old age. But the parenthetical comment about Sarah's menopause is mentioned in the middle of her overhearing and responding with the word and ending parenthetical comment, just as one finds in the Book of Moses. This is an interesting example because the parallel is only clear in Hebrew, as the King James did not render the construction as woodenly in this case. Another common feature in the Hebrew Bible that one sometimes sees in the Book of Moses relates to the use of the word behold. This word, hineh in Hebrew, may seem as though it is used more or less randomly, but it actually has a number of different functions. One of these functions is to give background information. One sees this in the Book of Moses, in which Moses asks God a question, and there is a brief pause to give background information before proceeding, beginning with the word behold. Moses 1:30-31 reads, "And it came to pass that Moses called upon God, saying, Tell me, I pray thee, why these things are so, and by what thou madest them. And behold, the glory of the Lord was upon Moses, so that Moses stood in the presence of God. And the Lord God said unto Moses, For mine own purpose have I made these things." Genesis 15:12-13 does something similar. Translated somewhat woodenly, this would read, "And it came to pass that the sun was going down, and a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and behold, a great terrifying darkness fell upon him. And he said to Abram," in these verses, Abram falls asleep, and the Lord speaks to him, but the behold introduces the background information. That a great terrifying darkness had also fallen on Abram. Understanding that behold can be used in this way can help readers to understand the Book of Moses better. One intriguing example of a Hebraism in the Book of Moses relates to Matthew Bowen's work on Hebrew wordplay in the Book of Moses. Bowen has argued persuasively that there is a possible Hebrew wordplay on the name Joseph in Moses 1:41, where the Lord talks about taking from the writings of Moses and then raising up another so that they shall be had again. Another possible example is a pun on the name Cain. In Moses 5:31, Cain says he is master of this great secret that I may murder and get gain. The name Cain in Hebrew is pronounced Cain, while the word gain, Kanin in Hebrew, is pronounced Kanayan. They're very, very similar. These names are similar enough to each other that it is likely an example of a pun on the name. What's intriguing about this is that the word Cain and gain also sound similar in English, suggesting that a carefully thought through translation is actually what we're seeing here in the Book of Moses. Joseph preserves the pun in the source language, presumably Hebrew, in the target language of English. Another Hebraism that helps to make sense of an unusual part of the text relates to the word translated as that which. The Hebrew word translated as that which, shar, the relative pronoun in Hebrew, always stays the same, regardless of gender or number. This explains the strange phrase in Moses 7:39, "And that which I have chosen hath pled before my face." In this verse, it's clear from the context that which I have chosen is Jesus, but this verse is unclear in English. However, if that which is a direct literal translation from the Hebrew, that's how one would render the word rather than he whom I have chosen, which is how we would usually say this in English. One interesting Hebraism is found in Moses 8:27. And thus Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord, for Noah was a just man and perfect in his generation, and he walked with God, as did also his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. In this verse, Noah is the one who walks, and his sons are inserted later as secondary subjects. This is common in Hebrew, with the verb being conjugated only for the primary subject and not for the secondary subjects. The Book of Moses has a surprising lack of adverbs as well, as we usually use them in English, and tends to use nouns and prepositional phrases instead. One good example of this comes in Moses 7:66, looking forth with fear. Generally, one would say looking forth fearfully rather than looking forth with fear, but this version of the phrase is how one would say this in Hebrew. One sees this in Isaiah 12, with joy shall you draw water, instead of joyfully shall you draw water. These kinds of Hebraisms can help readers understand the text better by not misreading portions of the text by assuming a native English construction for a phrase that's really a translation from a Hebrew text. However, understanding the underlying Hebrew can also help readers understand specific unusual phrases that are more difficult to understand otherwise. When examining the Book of Moses, one sometimes finds phrases that seem to come from Hebrew but are not translated the same way as they are in the King James Bible. Instead, they're taken basically word for word from Hebrew and translated quite literally. These phrases, known as calques, are what one might call phrase-based Hebraisms, and they occur throughout the text. One interesting example of this is found in Moses 6:52, which states that people should be baptized in the name of Christ, quote, who is full of grace and truth. This Johannine phrase appears 5 times in the Book of Moses, and one might initially just assume this is one occasion where Joseph Smith was expanding on the text of the Bible without the use of any kind of ancient forelogger. However, Joseph Smith's use of the Old Testament is more complicated than this in the Book of Moses, as well as his use of the New Testament. Full of grace and truth uses phraseology from the King James New Testament to render a phrase from the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew phrase, Rav Chesed Ve'emet, gets translated a couple ways in the King James Version of the Bible. Psalm 86:15 renders it as plenteous in mercy and truth. Exodus 34:6 renders it as abundant in goodness and truth. But full of grace and truth is a fine translation of this phrase, and it's clear that the Gospel of John gets this phrase from Exodus, as many commentators have noted. Thus, despite the New Testament language, this phrase may be an example of phrase-based Hebraism in the Book of Moses. Another type of Hebraism that helps readers to understand the text is chiasms, the use of inverted repetition, which is well known in Latter-day Saint circles. As with other kinds of Hebraisms observed in this paper so far, one must exercise a certain amount of caution when discussing chiasmus as a Hebraism in the Book of Moses. Because the Book of Moses survives only in translation, it's sometimes difficult to be sure about chiasms that exist in the text. As the prolific biblical scholar John Paul Heil has noted about the Pauline epistles, one must be cautious when proposing chiastic structures in a book, even when one has the text in the original language. One must look carefully at the actual words of the text to determine if there is indeed a chiastic correspondence between parts of the text, and not just rely on general thematic chiasms, which one could accidentally impose on the text rather than draw out of the text. Because the Book of Moses exists only in translation, one cannot always expect the exact words of the text to match when examining chiasms, making the project even more difficult. That being said, one possible example of a chiasm in the Book of Moses that survived translation into English is Moses 1:40 through 2:1, as noted by Mark Johnson, as you see here. Another chiasm that is larger and perhaps slightly more speculative, pointed out by Johnson, is found in Moses 1:1 through 2:1. Another chiasm in Moses 1 that's somewhat tighter is found in Moses 1:31 through 39. However, chiasms like this are not the only kind of parallelisms in the Book of Moses. Moses 1:1 through 41 is another interesting possible example of a large parallelism in the text. Another parallelism is found near the beginning of the chapter, setting off Moses' first encounter with God. Chiasmus has the potential to be an immensely helpful tool in analyzing the Book of Moses because it could help guide readers through the text and help them understand the main foci of various portions of the text. These examples, while useful, are only a place to begin. Unfortunately, there's one significant methodological problem that one encounters when examining Hebraisms in the Book of Moses. The Hebrew of Moses' time is different from the Hebrew of later times. There are only about 8 to 10 chapters of the Bible that contain this early Hebrew. This means that it's more difficult to determine the style of the Hebrew well enough to identify Hebraisms in the Book of Moses. Thankfully, there may be ways around this problem of finding Hebraisms in the Book of Moses based on such a small corpus. An examination of Ugaritic style might also be in order, looking at you, Dan Belknap, as this language is related to Hebrew, but we have more examples of it from closer to the time of Moses, as noted above. The language of the Alamarna letters might also be helpful as well when considering Hebraisms in the Book of Moses. With all this in mind, there may be one Hebraism in the Book of Moses that connects to this earlier stratum of the language, related to the last one of the list of conventional Hebraisms mentioned earlier. Generally, Hebrew adjectives are fairly straightforward. In both classical Biblical Hebrew and late Biblical Hebrew, adjectives generally appear right after the word they're modifying, and they are translated the same way one would usually state the adjective in English. A good woman, a big city, whatever. However, archaic Biblical Hebrew does not work this way. These earliest biblical texts express the adjective differently through something called a construct chain. This is a Hebrew grammatical construction that is the Hebrew equivalent of the English word of. Deuteronomy 33, for example, uses this construction. Verse 19, for example, refers to the people offering sacrifices of righteousness, which means righteous sacrifices. Later Hebrew uses this construction, and one sees it fairly often in other parts of the Hebrew Bible. However, this is the only way adjectives appear in the oldest strata of the Hebrew Bible. This is interesting in light of Moses 6:57 and 7:35, in which the name for God is man of holiness. This is how one would literally translate the Hebrew construct form, and suggests the possibility that it could be seen as yet another Hebraism, but one that matches the kind of Hebrew one might expect to find from near the time of Moses. There is at least one other indication that at least parts of the Book of Moses relies on text that dates from an early time, because the Book of Moses may show an understanding of a Hebrew word taken from another language, called a loan word, that seems to have been lost later on. Moses 5:23 records God's reply to Cain when he offered an offering that was not accepted. If thou doest well, thou shalt be accepted, and if thou doest not well, sin lieth at the door, and Satan desireth to have thee. The extra phrase, and Satan desireth to have thee, not present in the King James Bible, may simply be Joseph's explanation of what it means for sin to lie at the door, as the expression is somewhat strange. However, the extra phrase is interesting in light of the origins of the word rabatz, translated as lieth in the King James. The word is a participle that comes from an Akkadian root and means to crouch or lie in wait, but also has the connotation of to lurk. In other words, sin is crouching or lurking outside Cain's door, in much the same way that a demon would in the Akkadian cultural sphere. However, as M.L. Barr has noted, the hypothesis that this word comes from Akkadian is complicated by the extremely problematic nature of the passage in the versions that we have outside the Book of Moses. He doesn't mention that. No satisfactory solution to its difficulties has yet been reached, he says. People generally understand the verse to mean, but if you don't do well or do your best or something, sin is a croucher demon at the door. However, Barr goes on to note that there are issues with this interpretation because many things about the verse are strange, including word order. However, he states that this word could refer to a demon who is trying to get Cain to murder Abel. The idea of the demon lurking at the door fits with how these kinds of demons are usually portrayed, lurking in places where people usually go, waiting to pounce. But the strange thing about this is that, as he notes, the Akkadian sources portray the Rabisu as a being that attacks its victims, not one that tempts them to commit sin. It's clear from the description above that this verse is somewhat problematic in the Hebrew Bible as it currently stands. When one looks at this issue in light of the verse in the book of Moses, however, the verse makes more sense. If thou doest well, thou shalt be accepted, and if thou doest not well, sin lieth at the door, and Satan desireth to have thee. Instead of one of these demons crouching outside the door, tempting them to sin, this version can be read to mean that Satan, an embodiment of sin, is lurking outside the door waiting to pounce on Cain so he can have him. God's telling Cain that Satan is lying in wait to capture Cain, as these demons were thought to do. Because these demons are mentioned as having this function in texts from the late Old Babylonian period, a few hundred years before Moses, this suggests the possibility that the book of Moses may reflect something very old indeed, perhaps from the time of Moses himself. However, one should be cautious in seeking to use data like this to date the book of Moses from Moses' time. Most of the Hebraisms cited above are taken from classical biblical Hebrew sources, not archaic biblical Hebrew sources. This means that the text could date from the time of Moses, but could also be much later. Matthew Bowen's work on wordplay in the book of Moses strongly suggests that the text was originally written in Hebrew, but beyond that, it's hard to say when the text was written, besides broadly claiming that it was probably written in antiquity or that it reflects ancient Semitic language patterns. As noted above, anyone seeking to use Hebraisms to establish the antiquity of the book of Moses should approach the task with great caution. Take, for example, the if-and construction. This may seem at first glance to be the Hebraism with the most potential for demonstrating the antiquity of the book of Moses, but this construction is never rendered this way in the King James translation of the Bible, suggesting that this is indeed an unmistakable example of a type translation on the part of Joseph Smith from an ancient text. Thus, the book of Moses must be ancient. Unfortunately, things are not so simple, even in the case of this most promising of Hebraisms. As odd as the construction may sound to us, it was apparently part of Joseph Smith's English, as it appears at least once in his writings. This doesn't mean that the if-and construction may not sometimes be an example of a tight translation from a Semitic Vorlage, but it's impossible to know whether it is or not, based on the available evidence. Amari Sonnen has noted that phrases that work fine in the target language and in Hebrew can add a Hebraic flavor to the text when it's used more often than one might expect, making phrases like this a sort of Hebraism, even if they're possible in the target language. The if-and construction may be something like that in English. Another example of this is the use of that in phrases like after that or because that, which are also common in English during some periods. As for the other Hebraisms noted above, it's difficult to know why they are present in the Book of Moses. They certainly could be there because Joseph was actually restoring an ancient text written in a Semitic language, but they could also be there because Joseph sought to mimic the style of the King James Bible as closely as possible when creating the Joseph Smith translation. However, if one assumes that the Book of Moses comes from an ancient Semitic Vorlage, based on the abundance of other types of evidence found in the text, then one can use these Hebraisms as a way to understand the text better, rather than trying to use the Hebraisms to demonstrate the antiquity of the text. Any single Hebraism by itself could possibly be the result of Joseph Smith mimicking the Bible to make the text sound more biblical, or could be the result of chance. Some Hebraisms may be difficult to chalk up to coincidence, but one should reserve a certain level of academic humility about such things, realizing that because the text survives only in translation, the task is inherently speculative. However, these Hebraisms can and should be used as a tool to help readers understand the text better. As scholars with a background in Semitic languages like Archaic Hebrew and Ugaritic read through the Book of Moses more carefully, they may be able to gain a better understanding of Hebraisms in the Book of Moses, making it a better tool for understanding the Book of Moses. In addition, scholars interested in the Septuagint and other texts translated from Hebrew or Aramaic may also be able to bring these methods to bear on the Book of Moses in a more rigorous way, allowing for a better understanding of the Book of Moses. Many of the Hebraisms discussed in this paper deserve more attention and further discussion. In many ways, this very preliminary review of the topic is more of an invitation to other scholars to examine the text for more Hebraisms and to nuance our understanding of the ones in this paper. Some of the most interesting Hebraisms, phrase-based Hebraisms, or calques, are difficult to find because they're difficult to search for. One must simply know the Book of Moses well enough that one notices them when reading through the Hebrew Bible, or vice versa. But they can be very helpful when one is seeking to understand the nuance of unusual words and phrases. These kinds of Hebraisms have great potential to help readers to understand the Book of Moses better, but have to be discovered serendipitously, and therefore slowly, meaning that it would be helpful to have more Hebraists involved in looking for them. Another thing that should be noted is that editing the Book of Moses to make it read better in English has likely removed a number of Hebraisms from the text, and it's preferable, but much more difficult, to use the original manuscript on the Joseph Smith Papers website when doing this kind of work. I've used the 2013 version of the text to give hope to those seeking to do work on this in the future. If some Hebraisms survive the revisions made to the text, there will likely be many more to uncover when examining the older version of the text. Ultimately, the key will be to use the underlying Hebrew to help readers understand the texts better. Understanding these Hebraisms will help readers to understand nuances of the Book of Moses better and ultimately gain greater insight into the text. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan, for your intriguing and very interesting presentation. I think that it will open up lots of new avenues for further study in this area. Perhaps one of the first questions I have is, after listening to all these interesting examples and the variety of examples that you've presented, what do you think are the three most convincing Hebraisms in the Book of Moses, and why?
The three most convincing ones. I would say that one of the most convincing ones is Matt Bowen's note about Joseph and again. That's a very good one because it actually places it in Hebrew pretty certainly, and so that one is pretty good to be able to say, yeah, this is from Hebrew. Another one that I think is good is a related one, the Cain one, because that also puts you very solidly in Hebrew, right? And so those are two that I think are really, really good ones as far as actually being able to say, no, this is almost certainly from Hebrew, not some other language. Another one, though, that's useful for actually understanding the text the best may actually be the use of that. So that's one of those things that I never really thought it was weird until I started talking to people about it who thought that it was weird, and they said, "Well, what does that mean? Is it because that Satan, like signaling out Satan or something, rebelled against me, or after that? But what does that mean?" I think realizing that that's just a Hebrew construction and that you can almost sort of drop it most of the time, that helps you understand a lot of that stuff way better and avoid confusion. So as far as like payoff, that may be one of the most interesting ones.
Interesting. When you just sit down and read the Book of Moses, do these kinds of Hebraisms pop out to you continually, like in most verses, or how often do you seem to run into that?
You know what? The Hebraisms actually are fairly common, yeah. They're fairly common throughout the whole thing, actually. What's interesting, though, is when I first read this, when I first got the invitation to do this paper and sat down and read the Book of Moses, I thought, it's not that many of them. And so I made a short list and I was like, okay, like, what do you do, right? And then I was like, Mel, maybe there's more in there. So I asked David Larson and Jackson Abhow to help me, and then I sat down and did it again, and I started going through it. Still didn't really find much, and then I said, wait a second. We have good examples of people translating into an Indo-European language like English from Greek, or from Hebrew. That's the Septuagint, right? So I just started going through all the quirky Septuagint things in my head and going, oh, let's see if that's in the Book of Moses. Oh, and there they were, right? So it's not like it just like sticks out to me immediately when I read it, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized, oh, there are a lot of these. And then Jackson and David got back to me with others that I hadn't noticed, and I realized there's actually a lot of these throughout the whole text, but you don't necessarily notice them at first, or you don't notice that they're Hebraisms at first, right?
Okay, so I've noticed that the formula "and it came to pass" occurs much more frequently in the Book of Moses than it does in Genesis. Why do you think that is so?
I think some of that might have to do with translation. because I was wondering the same thing, and then I went back and actually just looked up the Hebrew via he, and it came to pass. And I realized that, yeah, it's a little bit more common still in the Book of Moses, but actually not that much. Once you actually go back and find the word via he in Hebrew and sort of count it up per chapter, it starts to be actually pretty close to the same as the Book of Moses. The King James doesn't always translate it because it feels crazy, right? It feels absurd to do it so literally all the time. But if you were to actually do it, it'd be almost the same. Yeah.
Maybe the translators were being a little more poetic and not so repetitive. Okay.
Right.
Do you think it's possible to determine the original language of the Book of Moses? And what do you think the key factors are in that determination?
Yeah, that's hard because number one, what do you mean by original language, right? And because, for example, is this in archaic biblical Hebrew or classical biblical Hebrew? I don't know. That's actually a pretty hard thing. We don't have enough archaic biblical prose to know, right? So as far as dialect, that's almost impossible, maybe. I don't know. Like I said, we might have other people that would be better equipped to deal with that know the super old strata better and know the really old languages better, older than classical biblical Hebrew. But within that, I think it might be possible to determine that it's in Hebrew. But what you'd have to do is you would have to find a number of different, very solid Hebrew puns to be able to say, okay, yeah, this has got to be Hebrew, and it wouldn't work in, say, Aramaic or Greek or something, right? Um, Another thing is to find quotations of it in Hebrew texts. There's one good one, and there may actually be a couple other good ones. Cases where they're quoted in the Dead Sea Scrolls, where pieces of it are quoted, and so that's pretty good to be able to say, yeah, maybe this is Hebrew, right? But even then, Dead Sea Scroll authors may be quoting stuff that they have in Aramaic, right? So um, it's a hard question. If we had a bunch of really solid puns, Matt Bowen, just keep on keeping on with that. Maybe if we found a bunch of them, then maybe we could say, yeah, this is definitely Hebrew, right?
Do you think there's a difference in the methodology of studying Hebraisms in the book of Moses versus studying them in the Book of Mormon? And what might we learn from that comparison?
Yeah, I would say the methodological difference is that number one, the Book of Moses may be what you call sort of a mixed text, and there's a lot of work done on this. That the Joseph Smith translation has not only just what Joseph Smith is receiving as this sort of restoring ancient text by revelation, but he may also be at times expanding on it himself by revelation. So it's hard to know at times which is which. And so that makes that a little bit methodologically difficult because we might be dealing with a mixed text. I don't know how mixed the Book of Moses is, honestly, but other parts of the JST, it's pretty clear, are sort of mixed. So, but that does complicate it slightly. Um, Another thing that may that complicates the question is dialect again. Is this archaic biblical Hebrew, like from Moses' time, or is this classical biblical Hebrew? Because that changes what Hebraisms you look for and how you look for them, right? Um, but honestly, I I think that as I was doing this, I often would think, yeah, there's stuff like this in the Book of Mormon too, right? And I think methodologically, it is pretty similar, although the big kicker is the dialect, right? That's maybe one of the biggest things. Which dialect are you looking at?
What has been the biggest payoff to you of doing this study?
Yeah, the biggest payoff I think is sort of potential for me. There's a lot of good potential for future work on this, not just to be able to figure out the dialect, although that would be interesting, but to understand the text better. I think if we were to really do this carefully and systematically, especially in chapters 1 and especially in chapters 5 through 7, where there aren't really parallels with things in Genesis to speak of, that would be a really, really big help in figuring out nuance. Um, because so often, especially with calcs or the phrase-based Hebraisms, you can find you have these phrases, and you're not 100% sure what they mean in English. And you can go pull out the 1828 Webster's Dictionary, but you got to realize that this is a translation, and it's a little bit hard to figure out what stuff means. But if I can say, oh, this is a translation of this Hebrew phrase, not translated the same as the King James, but here it is in Hebrew, then I can look up the Hebrew words and I can go, okay, this means this, it's used in these other places, and then you finally got something.
Oh. Well, thank you very much. That was a great piece of work and very interesting to see those parallels.